The Spanish-American War marked a pivotal turning point in American history as the nation emerged from isolationism to become a global colonial power. This brief but brutal conflict sparked a chain reaction of events that would reshape the world order and test the mettle of American leadership. Witness the birth of a new empire, forged in blood, fire, and controversy. As the Cuban War for Independence raged on from 1895 to 1897, the island's struggle against Spanish rule became increasingly entwined with American economic interests in the Caribbean. The Cubans, led by José Martí and Calixto Garcia, employed a guerrilla warfare strategy that targeted Spanish colonial infrastructure, including sugar plantations and railroads, which were largely owned by American investors. This tactic not only disrupted the Spanish economy, but also jeopardized American business interests, prompting many to call for intervention. The Cuban Rebellion's impact on American trade was significant, with sugar exports plummeting and investments in the island's infrastructure at risk of being destroyed or expropriated. The USS Eagle, a U.S. Navy ship, had already been dispatched to Cuba in 1895 to protect American citizens and property, but as the conflict escalated, the U.S. government faced mounting pressure from business leaders and politicians to take more decisive action. It was during this period that William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal began to play a significant role in shaping public opinion on the Cuban question. Hearst's brand of yellow journalism, characterized by sensationalized reporting and emotive headlines, helped to galvanize American sympathy for the Cuban cause and inflame anti-Spanish sentiment. His newspaper's coverage of Spanish atrocities, such as the Reconcentración policy, which forced Cubans into concentration camps, outraged the American public and created a sense of moral urgency around the issue. One event that epitomized the volatile nature of this period was the Delaune letter controversy in 1897. Enrique Dupuy de Lomé, the Spanish ambassador to the United States, had written a private letter to a friend in which he described President William McKinley as weak and accused him of being driven by electoral considerations in his handling of the Cuban issue. The letter was intercepted by Cuban rebels and leaked to the press, prompting widespread outrage and demands for Delomé's resignation. The Delaune letter affair marked a significant turning point in American-Spanish relations, as it seemed to confirm long-held suspicions about Spanish duplicity and arrogance. The incident also highlighted the deepening divide between the two nations, with many Americans now openly questioning whether Spain was capable of governing its colonies humanely and efficiently. As tensions continued to escalate, the stage was set for a dramatic confrontation between the United States and Spain, one that would have far-reaching consequences for both nations and the world at large. The Cuban Rebellion's influence on American politics extended beyond the realm of diplomacy, as politicians from both parties began to stake out positions on the issue. Some, like Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, advocated for military intervention to protect American interests and uphold humanitarian principles, while others, such as President McKinley, preferred a more cautious approach, seeking to avoid war while still applying pressure on Spain to reform its colonial policies. As the Cuban Rebellion continued to simmer, a spark was about to ignite the flames of war. On February 15, 1898, the USS Maine, a U.S. Navy battleship, exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 266 American sailors and officers. The cause of the explosion remained unclear, but the incident sent shockwaves throughout the United States, fueling outrage and demands for action against Spain. The sinking of the Maine became a rallying cry, with newspapers like William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World sensationalizing the event and whipping up public frenzy. The phrase, "Remember the Maine," soon became a battle cry as Americans from all walks of life called for revenge against Spain. War fever swept the nation, with protests, demonstrations, and patriotic rallies erupting in cities across the country. Despite the growing clamor for war, President McKinley remained hesitant, still hoping to find a peaceful resolution to the crisis. He had long been wary of intervention, fearing the consequences of military action and the potential costs to American lives and treasure. However, as the days passed and public pressure mounted, McKinley found himself increasingly isolated in his reluctance. Even his own party began to turn against him, with Republican leaders like Senator Henry Cabot Lodge and Representative Thomas Reed urging him to take a firmer stance against Spain. On March 9, 1898, McKinley asked Congress for $50 million in emergency funds to prepare the military for potential action, a move that many saw as a tacit admission that war was inevitable. The following week, on March 17, the president received a report from the Navy's Board of Inquiry into the Maine explosion, which concluded that the cause was likely a mine or other external explosive device. Although the report did not explicitly blame Spain, it helped to further erode McKinley's resistance to intervention. As the drums of war beat louder, McKinley finally relented, sending a message to Congress on April 11, 1898, asking for authorization to use military force against Spain. The president's request was not a declaration of war per se, but rather a call for congressional approval to intervene in Cuba and protect American interests. After several days of debate, during which proponents of war like Senator Lodge and Representative Reed clashed with anti-war lawmakers like Senator George Frisbee Hoar, Congress passed a joint resolution authorizing the president to use force against Spain. On April 20, 1898, McKinley signed the congressional resolution which effectively declared war on Spain. The measure also included an amendment, introduced by Senator Henry Teller of Colorado, disclaiming any intention to annex Cuba and pledging to recognize the island's independence once Spain was defeated. With the die cast, the United States and Spain were now formally at war, setting in motion a chain of events that would have far-reaching consequences for both nations and the world at large. As the United States declared war on Spain, the American military began to mobilize with unprecedented speed and efficiency. In April 1898, the U.S. Army consisted of just 28,000 regular troops, but within a matter of weeks, this number would swell to over 70,000 as volunteers and reservists flocked to join the colors. The rapid expansion was made possible by the efforts of Secretary of War Russell Alger, who works tirelessly to coordinate the mobilization effort, and Quartermaster General Marshall Ludington, who oversaw the procurement of equipment, supplies, and transportation. One of the most iconic units to emerge during this period was the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, better known as the Rough Riders. Formed in San Antonio, Texas, on May 9, 1898, the regiment was led by Colonel Leonard Wood, a seasoned military officer, and Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, the former Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Roosevelt, who had resigned his post to join the fight, brought his characteristic enthusiasm and energy to the endeavor, helping to recruit a diverse group of volunteers from across the country, including cowboys, ranchers, and Ivy League graduates. As the Rough Riders began their training, another crucial development was unfolding in the Pacific. On April 25, 1898, Commodore George Dewey, commander of the U.S. Asiatic Squadron, received secret orders from the Navy Department to proceed to the Philippines and engage the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. Dewey's squadron, consisting of 4 cruisers, 2 gunboats, and a revenue cutter, had been stationed in Hong Kong awaiting instructions. With his new orders in hand, Dewey set sail for the Philippines, aware that he would be outnumbered by the Spanish fleet, but confident in the superiority of American naval firepower. Meanwhile, the Spanish military was struggling to respond effectively to the sudden outbreak of war. Despite having a larger army than the United States, Spain's forces were scattered across its vast colonial empire, and many units were understrength or poorly equipped. In Cuba, General Arsenio Martínez Campos, the Spanish commander, faced significant challenges in mobilizing his troops and preparing for battle. The Cuban rebels, who had been waging a guerrilla war against Spanish rule since 1895, had already disrupted communication lines and destroyed key infrastructure, making it difficult for Martínez Campos to coordinate his defenses. In addition to these strategic disadvantages, the Spanish Navy was also at a significant disadvantage. The U.S. Navy's modern battleships, such as the USS Oregon and the USS Indiana, outgunned and outmaneuvered their Spanish counterparts, which were largely obsolete and poorly maintained. As Dewey's squadron approached Manila Bay, the Spanish Admiral Patricio Montoyo y Pasaron was aware of the risks he faced, but he was determined to defend his position and protect the Philippines from American invasion. As Commodore George Dewey's squadron approached the Philippines, he was acutely aware of the significance of his mission. On April 30, 1898, He had received a message from the Navy Department, warning him that the Spanish fleet was likely to be found at Manila Bay and that he should be prepared to engage them at dawn on May 1st. Dewey's ships, including the USS Olympia, USS Baltimore, USS Raleigh, USS Concord, and USS Petrel, formed a formidable force with a combined firepower of over 200 guns. At 5:00 a.m. on May 1, 1898, Dewey's squadron entered Manila Bay, navigating through the narrow entrance between the islands of Corregidor and Caballo. As they emerged into the bay, the American ships formed a line of battle, with the USS Olympia leading the way. The Spanish fleet, under the command of Admiral Patricio Montojo y Pasaron, was anchored in the bay near the town of Cavite. Dewey's ships began to fire on the Spanish vessels at 5:41 a.m., and the Battle of Manila Bay had begun. The American ships steamed in a clockwise direction around the Spanish fleet, pouring broadside after broadside into the enemy vessels. The Spanish ships returned fire, but their guns were largely ineffective against the modern American warships. By 7:00 a.m., the Spanish fleet was in disarray, with several ships sunk or burning. Admiral Montojo y Pasaron's flagship, the Reina Cristina, was among the first to fall, struck by a shell from the USS Olympia that killed or wounded many of its crew. As the battle raged on, Dewey's ships continued to dominate the Spanish fleet, sinking or capturing several vessels. The American squadron suffered only minor damage and few casualties, while the Spanish lost over 400 men killed or wounded. By 12:30 p.m., the Battle of Manila Bay was effectively over, with the Spanish fleet defeated and American control of the bay established. However, despite their decisive naval victory, the Americans did not immediately capture the city of Manila. The city's defenses were still intact, and the Spanish garrison remained determined to resist. Dewey's ships blockaded the city, preventing any Spanish reinforcements or supplies from reaching it, but they did not attempt to storm the shore. Instead, they waited for the arrival of American ground troops, who would eventually besiege and capture the city. The news of the American victory at Manila Bay sent shockwaves around the world. The British, in particular, were impressed by the efficiency and power of the U.S. Navy and began to reevaluate their own naval capabilities. The German Empire, on the other hand, saw the American victory as a threat to its own colonial ambitions in the Pacific and began to make plans to challenge American dominance in the region. As the news of the American victory at Manila Bay spread, attention turned to the Caribbean, where the U.S. Navy was preparing to launch a campaign against Spanish forces in Cuba. In May 1898, Admiral William T. Seckenbar, Sampson's North Atlantic Squadron established a naval blockade of Cuban ports, aiming to prevent any Spanish reinforcements or supplies from reaching the island. The blockade was enforced by a fleet of modern warships, including the USS New York, USS Brooklyn, and USS Texas, which patrolled the waters off Cuba's northern coast. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy was also engaged in a cat-and-mouse game with Admiral Pascual Cervera's Spanish fleet, which had been spotted in the Caribbean. Cervera's fleet, comprising 4 cruisers and 3 destroyers, had sailed from Spain in April 1898, bound for Cuba. The Americans were determined to intercept and defeat the Spanish fleet, but Cervera proved to be a cunning opponent, using his knowledge of the Caribbean waters to evade detection. As the search for Cervera's fleet continued, the U.S. Marines launched an amphibious assault on Guantanamo Bay, a strategic harbor on Cuba's southeastern coast. On June 10, 1898, a battalion of Marines, led by Colonel Robert W. Huntington, landed at Guantanamo Bay with the objective of securing the harbor and establishing a base for future operations. The landing was supported by naval gunfire from the USS Marblehead and USS Eagle, which bombarded Spanish positions ashore. The Marines quickly overcame Spanish resistance and established a foothold on Cuban soil. However, they soon faced a more insidious enemy: tropical diseases such as malaria, yellow fever, and dysentery. The sweltering heat and humidity of the Caribbean summer created an ideal breeding ground for mosquitoes and other disease-carrying insects, which quickly began to take their toll on American forces. As the Marines dug in at Guantanamo Bay, they struggled to cope with the harsh conditions and the constant threat of disease. The lack of adequate medical care, sanitation, and mosquito netting made them vulnerable to illness, and soon the Marine camp was filled with sick and wounded men. Despite these challenges, the Marines persevered, knowing that their mission was crucial to the success of the larger campaign against Spanish forces in Cuba. As the Marines continued to secure their foothold at Guantanamo Bay, the main American army, led by General William R. Shafter, began its march towards Santiago de Cuba, the capital of Spanish-held Cuba. The city was heavily fortified, and the Americans knew they had to capture the strategic high ground outside the city before attempting a siege. On July 1, 1898, the American forces launched a two-pronged attack on the nearby towns of El Caney and San Juan Hill. The Battle of El Caney was a fierce and bloody fight, with the American forces facing stiff resistance from the Spanish defenders. The 12th Infantry Regiment, supported by artillery fire, slowly but surely pushed forward, taking heavy casualties in the process. Meanwhile, the Rough Riders, led by Theodore Roosevelt, were preparing to charge up San Juan Hill, a strategic ridge that offered a commanding view of the city. Roosevelt's famous charge was about to become one of the most iconic moments of the war. As the American artillery pounded the Spanish positions, the Rough Riders, along with the 1st Volunteer Cavalry and the 10th Cavalry, a regiment of African-American Buffalo Soldiers, prepared to advance. The Buffalo Soldiers, who had already proven themselves in numerous battles, played a crucial role in the charge, providing covering fire and supporting the Rough Riders as they pushed forward. At 12:15 p.m. on July 1st, the American forces launched their assault on San Juan Hill. Roosevelt, mounted on his horse Texas, led the charge, shouting, "Forward, men! Forward!" as they advanced up the hill. The Spanish defenders put up a fierce resistance, but the Americans pushed forward, taking cover behind rocks and bushes as they climbed higher. The Buffalo Soldiers, with their expert marksmanship, helped to pin down the Spanish troops, allowing the Rough Riders to reach the crest of the hill. The battle was intense and chaotic, with men from both sides falling in droves. But the Americans held their ground, and by 10:30 p.m., they had taken the hill. The Spanish defenders were either killed or captured, and the Americans had secured a vital strategic advantage. As the dust settled, Roosevelt stood victorious on the crest of San Juan Hill, his Rough Riders cheering around him. The fall of San Juan Hill marked the beginning of the end for Spanish control in Cuba. On July 2nd, the American forces began their siege of Santiago, with artillery and infantry units taking up positions around the city. The African-American troops played a key role in the siege, using their expertise to dig trenches and build fortifications. As the Americans tightened their grip on the city, the Spanish defenders became increasingly desperate. On July 3rd, the American forces launched a series of probing attacks against the Spanish lines, testing their defenses and looking for weak points. The Buffalo Soldiers were at the forefront of these attacks, using their knowledge of the terrain to outflank and outmaneuver the Spanish troops. As the day drew to a close, the Americans had made significant gains, pushing the Spanish back on all fronts. As the American forces continued their siege of Santiago, Admiral Pascual Cervera, commander of the Spanish Caribbean Fleet, grew increasingly desperate. With his ships bottled up in the harbor and the city on the brink of collapse, Cervera knew that his only hope was to attempt a breakout. On July 3, 1898, he made his move, ordering his fleet to make a desperate dash for the open sea. The Spanish fleet, consisting of 4 cruisers and 2 destroyers, steamed out of the harbor at 9:30 a.m., with Cervera's flagship, the Infanta Maria Teresa, leading the way. The American naval blockade, however, was ready and waiting. Admiral William Sampson's fleet, which had been patrolling the waters off Santiago, sprang into action as soon as the Spanish ships were spotted. The USS Brooklyn, a powerful cruiser commanded by Captain Francis Cook, was the first American ship to engage the Spanish fleet. As the Infanta Maria Teresa emerged from the harbor, the Brooklyn opened fire, striking the Spanish ship with several well-placed shells. The other American ships quickly joined in, unleashing a hail of gunfire that ripped through the Spanish fleet. The Spanish ships, however, refused to give up without a fight. The cruiser Vizcaya, commanded by Captain Antonio Ulete, returned fire with its own guns, scoring several hits on the USS Brooklyn. But the American ship's superior firepower and armor soon told, and the Vizcaya began to take on water at an alarming rate. As the battle raged on, the Spanish ships began to fall one by one. The destroyer Pluton was the first to go, sunk by a combination of gunfire and torpedoes from the USS Eagle and USS Gloucester. The cruiser Almirante Oquendo followed soon after, run aground and set ablaze by American shells. The Infanta Maria Teresa, Cervera's flagship, was the last Spanish ship to remain afloat, but even she could not withstand the relentless pounding from the American fleet. At 10:15 p.m., the Infanta Maria Teresa ran aground off the coast of Santiago, her crew abandoning ship as flames engulfed the vessel. The destruction of the Spanish Caribbean fleet marked a turning point in the war. With their naval power broken, the Spanish were unable to resupply or reinforce their troops in Cuba, and the American army was free to continue its advance on Santiago. The city itself would fall just 2 weeks later, on July 17, 1898, marking the effective end of Spanish rule in Cuba. As the Spanish Caribbean fleet lay destroyed off the coast of Santiago, the city's defenders were faced with an impossible situation. With their naval power broken and the American army closing in, General José Toral, the Spanish commander, knew that further resistance was futile. On July 17, 1898, after a brief but intense siege, Toral surrendered the city to American forces, marking a decisive victory for the United States. The fall of Santiago sent shockwaves throughout the Spanish colonies, and soon other islands began to fall into American hands. In Puerto Rico, a brief but spirited campaign was waged by American forces under the command of General Nelson Miles. Landing at Guanica on July 25, Miles's troops quickly overran the island, facing minimal resistance from the outnumbered and outgunned Spanish garrison. By August 12, the entire island was in American hands, with the Spanish governor, Manuel Macias, surrendering the capital city of San Juan. Meanwhile, half a world away, American forces were achieving similar successes in the Philippines. After a series of intense battles, including the Battle of Manila Bay, which saw the destruction of the Spanish Pacific Fleet, American troops under the command of General Wesley Merritt closed in on the city of Manila. On August 13, after a brief but fierce fight, the city fell to American forces, marking the effective end of Spanish rule in the Philippines. As the news of these victories reached Washington, there was a sense of jubilation and relief. After just 10 weeks of fighting, the United States had emerged victorious, having defeated a major world power and secured significant territorial gains. The war, which had begun with such uncertainty and doubt, had ended in a stunning triumph for American arms. As the dust settled, the United States began to consolidate its gains, establishing military governments in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, and setting the stage for a new era of American expansionism and global influence. In the aftermath of the war, American troops remained occupied with mopping up operations, securing key cities and towns, and establishing order in the newly conquered territories. In Cuba, General William Shafter's forces worked to rebuild and restore the island's infrastructure, while in Puerto Rico, General Miles' troops focused on establishing a stable and efficient military government. In the Philippines, General Merritt's forces faced the daunting task of pacifying a vast and diverse archipelago, where insurgent groups and local warlords posed a significant challenge to American authority. As the last remnants of Spanish resistance crumbled, attention turned to securing a lasting peace. On August 12, 1898, a protocol was signed in Washington, D.C., establishing a ceasefire between the United States and Spain. This preliminary agreement paved the way for formal negotiations, which would ultimately determine the fate of the territories seized by American forces during the war. The stage was set for the Treaty of Paris, a diplomatic conference that would convene in the French capital on October 1, 1898. The American delegation, led by Secretary of State William R. Day, arrived in Paris with a clear mandate to secure Spanish cession of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The Spanish team, headed by Eugenio Montero Rios, was equally resolute, albeit with a weaker hand. As negotiations progressed, it became increasingly evident that Spain would be forced to relinquish control over its prized colonies. On December 10, 1898, the Treaty of Paris was signed, formally ending the Spanish-American War and marking a seismic shift in the global balance of power. Under the terms of the treaty, Spain ceded Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. The Philippines, with its strategic location and vast natural resources, was a particularly prized acquisition. However, the American government agreed to pay Spain $20 million for the archipelago, a sum that would help to compensate the Spanish for their losses. This payment would later become a point of contention in the United States, as critics argued that it represented an unjustified subsidy to a defeated enemy. As the Treaty of Paris made its way to the U.S. Senate for ratification, a fierce debate erupted over the wisdom of American expansionism. The anti-imperialist movement, which had been simmering beneath the surface during the war, now gained momentum. Prominent figures such as Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and William Jennings Bryan spoke out against the annexation of territories, arguing that it was incompatible with American values and would lead to a corrupting influence on the nation's politics. In February 1899, the Senate finally voted on the Treaty of Paris, with a two-thirds majority required for ratification. After weeks of intense lobbying and debate, the treaty was approved by a margin of just one vote, 57-27. The outcome was far from certain until the very end, with several senators switching their positions in the days leading up to the vote. As the news of the treaty's ratification spread, it marked a significant turning point in American history, cementing the country's status as a global power and setting the stage for a new era of imperial expansion and international engagement. As the Treaty of Paris was ratified, the United States emerged as a colonial power, with its newfound territories stretching across the Caribbean and Pacific. In Cuba, American occupation authorities worked to establish a stable government, but with significant restrictions on Cuban independence. The island's new constitution, drafted by the U.S. military governor, General Leonard Wood, included provisions that limited Cuban sovereignty and ensured American control over key aspects of the economy and foreign policy. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, a different story was unfolding. Emilio Aguinaldo, the leader of the Philippine Revolution against Spanish rule, had declared independence in 1898, but his government was not recognized by the United States. As American forces consolidated their control over the archipelago, tensions between the two sides escalated, and in February 1899, the Philippine-American War broke out. The conflict would last for 3 years, claiming the lives of tens of thousands of Filipinos and over 4,000 American soldiers. In Washington, D.C., policymakers were grappling with the implications of their new colonial role. In 1900, Senator Orville Platt introduced an amendment to the Army Appropriations Act, which would have far-reaching consequences for Cuba and the Caribbean. The Platt Amendment, as it came to be known, established certain conditions for Cuban independence, including the creation of a Cuban constitution that would limit the island's sovereignty and grant the United States control over key aspects of its foreign policy. The amendment also led to the establishment of American naval bases in Cuba, including the strategic base at Guantanamo Bay, which would become a symbol of American power in the region. As the United States asserted its influence in the Caribbean, it also began to develop a new approach to diplomacy, one that would come to be known as the Big Stick policy. This approach, championed by President Theodore Roosevelt, emphasized the use of military power and economic coercion to achieve American objectives abroad. In 1901, Roosevelt articulated his vision for American foreign policy in a speech at the Minnesota State Fair, where he famously declared, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far." The Roosevelt Corollary, as this doctrine came to be known, asserted that the United States had a right to intervene in the affairs of its neighbors, to maintain stability and protect American interests. This policy would have significant consequences for the region, as the United States began to exert its influence over the Caribbean and Central America. As the Philippine-American War drew to a close in 1902, the United States was poised to consolidate its gains and establish itself as a major world power. The war had been brutal and devastating, with widespread human rights abuses committed by American forces. However, it had also marked a significant turning point in American history, as the country emerged from its isolationist shell and began to assert its influence abroad. The Spanish-American War marked a pivotal moment in American history, catapulting the United States to the global stage and forever altering the nation's role in international affairs. the war's impact was far-reaching, from the acquisition of territories that would shape the country's future to the emergence of a new era of imperialism and military interventionism. As we reflect on this conflict, we are reminded that the true cost of war extends beyond the battlefield, influencing the course of nations and the lives of generations to come. The echoes of 1898 can still be heard today, a testament to the enduring power of history to shape our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. Thank you for joining me on this journey through military history. Until next time, I'm General Biography reminding you to keep marching toward victory.